All right, you just heard from our voter panel on why teaching Black history is so controversial and if the war on woke is a winning strategy in 2024. Back with me now to discuss, we have Dan Harris, Jessica Washington, Lauren Leader, and Margaret Hoover. Dan, I was interested to see in the notes that you say you pay a lot of attention to woke. Why?
I pay attention to people fighting. It's interesting to me how the human animal interacts. I'm always interested in that. And what I took away from that panel was it's great to see Americans disagreeing agreeably.
One of the things that I found fascinating about this panel is that they all were quite clear on how parents should have a hand in curriculum and teachers should have a hand in curriculum. And you'll see tomorrow when we have part two, I asked them to raise their hand for how many people thought that the governor of the state should dictate curriculum. None of them did. Even the people who agree with Ron DeSantis's position doesn't think the governor should unilaterally be making decisions like that, Margaret.
Yeah, I mean, these are questions for, look, they all agree that there should be some national standards or some common standards that everybody agrees to, but they also agree that these need to be crowdsourced locally, right? That it has to be a combination between parents and teachers and administrators and school boards, and this is this is the secret sauce and the messy formula for representative democracy. And I totally agree with you. Civil discourse is a civic responsibility. And what they were doing right there, thanks to your sort of guidance, Allison, was the messy work of democracy.
Well, Americans are closer together on a whole lot of issues that are become politically polarized, and this is a really good example of this. There's clearly a vocal minority of Americans who are fired up and angry that their kids are being pushed to study subjects that are uncomfortable to them. And there has been this undercurrent for the last few years of just rejection of anything that is about diversity and inclusion. And a lot of this has been pushed by Fox News over the last few years, that anything that is affirmatively trying to right the wrongs of the past or create a more equitable and level playing field is automatically racist against white people. It is fundamentally wrong. But ultimately, most Americans, and all the polls show this, most Americans embrace diversity. They understand that it's part of what makes America great.
But some people do think that woke has gone too far. I mean, even people on the left side.
That's a different question, though, than whether or not kids should be learning some core and fundamental facts about our country. And I'll just say personally, the most rewarding, as a white woman, the most rewarding and meaningful educational experiences of my life were the most uncomfortable ones that I was forced to have about race in high school, because I was lucky enough to go to a school that pushed us to really think about race and gender issues. Yeah. And it changed the course of my life. I now have Black children. I feel completely different than I think I would have in another time if I hadn't had those opportunities. I'll never understand it fully. I'll never understand it fully, but they were the most formative and important conversations of my life to this day.
That's amazing.
The ones I had at 16.
Jessica.
Yeah, and I think having those uncomfortable conversations, they have to happen because we can't dig our head in the sand. Unfortunately, racism is very real. Inequality is very real. Gender inequality, racial inequality, all of these attacks against LGBTQ folks, these are all very real things. And if we're not willing to have those conversations, we cannot, and anti-Semitism as well, we cannot move forward. And so you're right, we have to be able to have these conversations, and people can't be scared that they're gonna feel bad. I think that's what has to happen. And I think that's part of why it can't just be completely left open to parents, because I think parents are going to have this instinct. I have to protect my kid from ever feeling bad, ever feeling like they've done the wrong thing. And sometimes you are going to do the wrong thing, and it is okay. And we have to teach children that it is okay to do and say the wrong thing and engage in these conversations so that they can become good members of society.
What happens when we have parents or political leaders who are Holocaust deniers? What happens when they get on school boards? Does it become acceptable for those parents to say, I don't believe in the Holocaust, I don't want my kids to learn about it? That's actually a real issue in the country today at a time where we're seeing surging anti-Semitism all over the country. So, there's got to be a line which says, the politicization of education is a no-win. It's a no-win for families. It's a no-win for kids.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about what Senator Tim Scott said. So Tim Scott, as you all know, is eyeing a presidential run. And he was saying that all of this woke stuff and progressive stuff, I mean, I'm paraphrasing and trying to use shorthand. He says that it actually, I'll read what he said. These people who call themselves progressive are attacking every rung of the ladder that helped me climb. I was the teenager whose spirit would have been crushed by a culture obsessed with identity politics and racial strife. And he also went on to say that our founders were geniuses. We should celebrate, not cancel them. Indeed, we're a land of opportunity, not a land of oppression. So it's interesting to hear him I mean, obviously,
He's been
everybody
saying
has a
this
different
for
take on
years.
what, everybody has their own take on what motivated them, what was the engine of their driver. And it sounds like, he was able to navigate through clearly a challenging upbringing.
And I understand when you have come out of the other end of something like that and you can say, I did this on my own. That feels great. It feels great. But I cover inequality for a living. And what I can say is, this is not a problem of people who just didn't believe in the American dream enough. This is not a problem of people who just didn't believe in themselves. These are factors like redlining, like all these other systemic inequalities. This is not just, oh, I didn't believe in the American dream, and so therefore I'm living in poverty. That's just not how it happens.
Intergenerational trauma. There are a lot of factors that play into this. I think one of the things that's interesting to me is that we're talking about being comfortable with discomfort. It feels like there is an uncomfortable paradox that I think most Americans can live with, but it seems like people on the fringes can't, which is that this is a great country. Our founders did incredible things, and they did unspeakably horrible things too, and we have a very painful history. Both things can be true at the same time, and it feels like most people can wrap their heads around this, but people on the edges of the debate are weaponizing it.
But I also think
That's
that
exactly
Jessica's right that when it comes to your children, you don't want them to feel guilty. So if there's some uncomfortable conversation that's happening, that if they're being made to feel guilty, or if they just accidentally feel guilty, I mean, by byproduct of having this uncomfortable, they feel guilty, then suddenly parents want to shield them from
Well,
that.
you're just delaying the inevitable because life is uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean, and that is exactly right. The weaponization of these topics, right? And back to Tim Scott. I mean, look, this has become a very core part of the Republican talking points really since Trump, which is this over-rotation on, he really weaponized white grievance, and it has become the core of so much of what, a lot of the sort of core Republican philosophy is all these culture war issues, as opposed to, really looking at, the economy, which they constantly, criticize the Biden administration for, but then the main talking point again and again and again becomes about this question of these culture war issues. I think it's a mistake. Tim Scott is entitled for sure to have his use. He's an extraordinary person who's accomplished amazing things. But for this to be the central conversation, his campaign tells you something about where we're going to be for the rest of this presidential cycle when there's much more
Margaret's
consequential
grimacing.
issues.
I mean,